When we arrived at the United Nations headquarters in New York, seeking to interview Kenya's permanent representative to the UN, Ambassador Macharia Kamau, we found him on his way out. He was getting ready to fly out to the South American city of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil for a series of preparatory meetings in readiness for the much publicized Earth Summit 2012. Nevertheless, he agreed to spare a few minutes and talk to us. In a nutshell, what are your expectations as a representative from Kenya?
Our expectations are very specific. We have a clear agenda that we have consistently pursued in the context of sustainable development, in the context of the way in which we want to use our energy mix in our country, for example. We cannot continue to rely on energy sources that are not either compatible with our sustainable development agenda, nor available to us financially because of the expense. So we have had to move to wind, air, solar, etc. But also we have very clear expectations as to the kind of institutions that we would like to see in the world that will help countries deal with the issue of sustainable development differently. So in this regard, we would like to see a strengthened UNEP. We would like to see more resources brought to UNEP. We would like to see UNEP turned into a universally, an organization that has universal membership. These are the sort of things that we will aspire to get out of the Rio conference. So we have very clear and very specific objectives that we want to achieve in Rio.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier about the expectations of Kenya as a country, but one cannot fail to notice, Balozi, that there have been many summits. There was the original Rio, 1992, and there was another one 10 years later in Johannesburg, what they called 10 plus, and now there's this one. Don't you sometimes get jaded? You feel like these meetings are just too many and very little coming out of it?
When you're struggling for doing what is right, yes, one can never be jaded. One is constantly trying to aspire to higher achievements, yes, because this is what our nation expects of us. Yes, there have been very many conferences. You can even go back as 1972 when the original Stockholm conference took place. It was there that UNEP was created, in Stockholm actually. Okay. And then we have built on that in subsequent conferences. But remember that between, in the last 20 odd years, 30 odd years, the world has changed beyond recognition. Mm-hmm. Most people forget that we did not have globalization. We did not have a global economy 20, 30 years ago. It didn't exist. We had a couple of transnational companies, yeah, but we did not have the global economy that we have today. Most people forget that the world as we know it today, where we have almost a unipolar political system that stretches across the world, yeah, didn't exist. We had the Soviet Union, yeah, we had the West, and we had a lot of poverty all over Asia and Africa. In the last 20, 30 years, all this has changed. Mm-hmm. China is now the second largest economy on earth. 20, 30 years ago, per capita income in China was about $300-400. Brazil is now the sixth largest economy on earth. They're bigger than Britain.
Yes.
And these are now becoming the powers, the economic powers that are driving the world economy. Clearly, the ball game has changed completely, and the rules of the game have to change as the game changes. And that is what we try to do when we go to these conferences, is that we try to manage the way in which the world engages collectively, and recognizing that the way in which we have been running our global economy, for example, the way in which nations have been producing and consuming, is actually seriously detrimental to our climate, to our biodiversity, to our soils, to our seas, and this is simply not sustainable.
Yes.
This is what we are now focused on. How can we come up with a better economic model that allows us to protect our seas, which are becoming too acidified and all the fish are dying, to protect our soil, which is becoming too polluted with all these inputs that we put into them that destroy the soil, what is happening to our biodiversity, all these animals and all these other creatures that help the circle of life to continue in a healthy way, what is happening to the climate. All these are things that we have now to reconsider. And even how we produce and how we consume has to be reconsidered so that the world can become a place in which we can continue to live as all these global economies grow.
Previously, you have expressed disappointment at the pace at which these bigger countries, bigger economies, and the industrialized ones are moving towards realization of some of the goals that have been set there before. What is your position right now?
Well, we remain seriously concerned.
Yes.
You see, for poor countries, for small middle-income countries such as ours, we have to be able to engage with the larger powers, the larger economies, in a way in which our economies can thrive. Now, if the larger economies continue to practice trade practices that are that harp back to the bad old days of protectionism, of the bad old days of heavy subsidies to their farmers, to their producers, the very subsidies and the very tariffs and the very taxes that make it impossible for our producers, our farmers, to compete, so that the playing field becomes stacked against us, we will forever remain poor. And what we want is not aid. We want to be able to develop our way through trade and through engagement out of poverty, so that we too can become industrialized, we can become competent economies, we can become thriving societies. And that is all within our reach. We have the capabilities, we have the people. Kenya has incredibly smart, intelligent, forthright, hard-working people. The problem is that the economies, the global economy is stacked up against us. So we are going to be trying to deal with these issues in the context of how we debate the green economy.
Yeah, but are they really listening, Balozi? Because
I think so. I mean, clearly it takes a little bit of time.
Yes.
Clearly there's a certain amount of intransigence. Clearly there's conservatism in the West that means that they have a very hard time drawing down their subsidies.
Yes.
On cotton farmers, on just basic products that they really do not need to subsidize.
Right.
Clearly they need to rejig their tariffs and their taxes that they have put, that have made it impossible for many economies to become competitive. But the global economy has its own logic. It has its own way of moving forward, and sooner or later these countries are going to realize that because we need to be able to be fully engaged with them, because we are a part of the global economy, that they are going to have to rework the way in which they engage with our part of the world, because our part of the world is also finding its own strength.
Yes.
Yes, and its own capabilities, and our economies are growing now. And just like China, just like Brazil, many African economies are charging forward, and they're going to be in a stronger position to renegotiate all of these things.
Let's for a moment talk about specifically the greenhouse gases. I know there was a summit, call it a conference in is it Durban, South Africa, about 1 year ago. And what I saw in the press, in the media then, was that the United States was not committing itself at all. Do you have anything to say about that right now?
Well, the United States has a very interesting approach.
Yes.
That it tends to take to these conferences. At first, I was rather perturbed by the way in which they would engage in these conferences. But I've come to realize that the domestic politics of the United States casts a very long shadow over in which American negotiators are able to negotiate at these conferences. As a consequence, what one really needs to look at, more importantly, is what the United States is doing in its own economy. because clearly we are seeing certain things that have changed quite radically. Anybody who lives in the United States knows that this is not the very heavily dirty economy that was heavily polluting that it was 20 years ago. Something has changed radically. The vehicles that they have on their roads, the way in which they're building their houses, the way in which they're managing their industry. Clearly, internally, they are setting higher and higher standards for themselves, and in the process, cleaning up their act. And if you look at the greenhouse gases that are emanating from the United States, they have been on a downward curve over the last 20, 30 years. So whilst they are not very engaging at the international level,
We are doing something.
they are doing
Locally.
something locally. It's an unfortunate way of doing business, but that's part of the political dynamics of the United States. However, one disturbing trend recently has been what we call the shale fracking, and they have been kicking up much more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere through this shale processing that they're using, and this has been a bit of a disturbing trend that will need to be kept. We'll all need to remain vigilant about moving forward.
Yeah. So now, do you sometimes get the feeling? I know you as somebody who is very optimistic, and you always you are always hopeful in the way, especially when you talk about these issues. But do you sometimes sit back in your office or even at home and think that you get the feeling that these big brothers do not really take the developing world, the developing nations seriously, really? They say that they can, pollute the world, and there's very little that the little nations down there can do because they don't have a lot of muscle. Do you feel so?
Actually, again, I have to be honest with you that because of the way in which the world, we all live in one world.
Yes.
So it's very easy to think that the West or the more developed country may want to neglect, say, China.
Yeah.
But China is now responsible for 1/3 of the global greenhouse gases.
Yes.
You cannot exactly ignore China, even though it's a developing country.
Right.
India is going to, the more it industrializes, is also going to kick up a lot more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Those greenhouse gases have the same effect in China as they do in England or in the United States, because we're in a global world. So once climate changes, it doesn't matter who's causing the climate to change, climate changes everywhere.
Yes.
So they are now compelled to engage with everybody. Because as I said a little earlier, Africa will industrialize. The question is, will Africa industrialize with good, clean, green energy and green industry?
Yes.
Or will they use the old, heavily polluting energies to industrialize? Now, we may decide that the only technology that's available to us is the old technology, in which case we will pollute heavily.
Yes.
And we are over 1 billion people now in Africa. If that happens, what happens to the global climate? What happens to biodiversity? What happens to the seas? We will pollute them just as much as the West has done in the 40s and 50s. So clearly, it's not an option for anybody to ignore anybody.
Yes.
Everybody has to take everybody seriously. The world has changed.
Let's talk about Rio very briefly, about Kenya's engagement. I know the president himself is scheduled to address the gathering. Does that, of course, show how seriously Kenya is taking this?
Yes,
this
absolutely.
summit?
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, His Excellency the President has time and again expressed himself unequivocally on all these issues. All these issues: climate change, energy, water, the forests, everything.
Yes.
And remember that we have always been champions of the environment, not because we have done such a great job of protecting our water towers.
Yes.
We haven't. But we have all come to realize that if we don't get our water towers sorted out, we are all going to be in trouble in our country. Our rivers are going to dry up. Our resources that help our farmers produce through irrigation and others are going to be in trouble. So clearly, our president has been championing these issues in very forthright ways. Now, in the context of cities, clearly we know that cities are now already consuming over 30% of the global resources, whether we're talking about water, whether we're talking about energy, whether we're talking about food. The cities are really a place where we have to think very carefully how we're going to manage cities and people in urban spaces. Now, over the next 20-30 years, even more people move into cities. Cities will continue to grow exponentially, and their appetite for energy, for water, will continue to grow exponentially. So we have to manage cities.
Yes.
And that is why UN Habitat is such a critically important part of this debate. So whether we're talking about UN Habitat or whether we're talking about cities in the context of the globalization of cities, whether we're talking about the environment, in all these areas, Kenya has to play its role. We must never forget that Kenya has a very special responsibility. Yeah, we are the host nation. We have an obligation to do more than just any average country in how we promote, how we support these institutions. We have a global responsibility as a country to make sure that these institutions work in the best possible way, that are given the best possible environment so that they can provide the best possible leadership in the areas of environment and in areas of urban and future city existence. That's our responsibility as a nation, and we have to go to Rio to champion this.
I'm talking about hosting UNEP and Habitat in Nairobi. There has been talk, I'm sure you're familiar with that some nations wanted to move the offices from Nairobi to somewhere else. How far has this gone? I'm sure you know, being the representative at the UN.
This will always be the case. We have to continually be vigilant. We have to continually invest in those institutions. Kenya cannot take those institutions for granted. It is imperative that as a nation, in the context of our political approach to these institutions, that we just don't claim them to be ours, but that we invest in them in a way in which the world can see that we are truly serious as the host countries and as the champions of these institutions for the world.
Finally, if you were to advise the local mwananchi in Kenya, people hear about environment, they say, oh, we are supposed to do this, that, or we shouldn't do this, that, or the other. But what is the role of the common man back there in the village when it comes to making sure that they also play their part?
Well, when Dr. Wangari Maathai was alive, this was one of her most incredible capabilities, is that she was able to break what is in fact these sophisticated global debates about environment and sustainability,
yes,
in ways in which the average human being can understand and become useful. We have to understand that the way in which, for example, we protect our forests is a critical mix of protecting our environment and making our societies sustainable. We have to understand that the way in which we use fertilizers, the way in which we use chemicals in agriculture, even as a small farmer, the way in which you use chemicals, which chemicals you use, whether these are chemicals that are destroying the soil, whether these are chemicals that are polluting the rivers and killing the fish. We have to be vigilant about that. And every farmer is confronted with this decision every day. We have to ask ourselves the kind of foods that we feed our animals, whether you keep chickens, whether you keep pigs, whether you keep goats, whether it's dairy cattle. Are you feeding them produce, foods that are supplemented with things that are poisonous to those animals, and that create that exacerbate the issues of cancer, for example, or that puts in poisons in these animals' diets that then end up as food for us as human beings. Not only are they harmful to the animals, but they're also harmful to those of us who eat those animals.
Right.
These are all common questions for the average person. And then, who do you support when you elect a member of parliament? Do you support a member of parliament who champions your environment? Do you support a member of parliament who cares about the sustainability of your community? What do we do with our rubbish? How do we handle our rubbish? Do we allow rubbish to become part of the pollutant in our society, which begins to undermine our biodiversity? These are questions for us.
Yes.
How do we handle our game? Wanyama wa porini. Do we care about these animals? Do we understand that they are part of the biodiversity that keeps us alive, and we have to keep them alive as well? These are common questions for all of us, and we have to answer them in a positive way as an average Kenyan.
It means that even as governments or representatives of governments are meeting us at the highest level possible, even the common mwananchi, the average person, has a role to play in all this.
Absolutely. What detergents you use at home, whether these are detergents that are harmful to the water supply, they are common questions of everyday living. And how we consume, the kind of things we choose to consume, how we produce, the kind of things we choose to produce, the means by which we produce, these are common questions for all of us.
Finally, tell us, how is Kenya taken by your colleagues here at the United Nations? Generally speaking, is it well respected?
I'm very proud of Kenya. We punch way over our weight, to use an American euphemism. We are a small country that carries global tasks in very admirable ways. And here I don't have even to be talking about environment, because in the United Nations I have to deal with a very broad range of issues in the economy, in security, in international reform, and constantly, without fail, Kenya is seen as an important interlocutor, as a very strong voice from Africa. Not just because we're Africans, but because we tend to deal with these issues and forthrightly discuss them in our own society. And this spills over into the way in which we handle our diplomacy, the way in which we handle our international relations. Kenya is championed in very many fora here in New York. And it's one of the most pleasing aspects of my job, is that we are taken extremely seriously and that we are felt as an important interlocutor. We are needed to be in these debates. The voice of Kenya has to be heard for these big debates to continue to take over, because this is a global platform. So yes, I'm very passionate about these issues, but I'm passionate about them because they're very important for our country and for our sustainability as a nation. No, I'm very proud, and it's extremely satisfying to be doing what I do here.
As diplomats and the heads of missions who represent their countries here at the UN put their final touches as they prepare for the Rio summit, there is no doubt that Kenya is not being left behind. Ben, MJ Murithi, NTV, New York, USA.